Welcome, everybody, to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris, sponsored by Grow at Annenberg. I'm Rachel Donadio. I'm the Curator of Cultural Programs here at the library, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for a conversation between Meghan O'Rourke with Clémentine Goldszal. We will be in conversation, the two will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from you in the audience and to some of you on the Zoom audience at home. So thanks for joining us. Meghan O'Rourke is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, as well as the author of The Long Goodbye and the poetry collections Sun and Days, Once, and Halflife. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and The New York Times, and more. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Radcliffe Fellowship, and a Whiting Nonfiction Award. And she resides in New Haven, Connecticut, where she teaches at Yale University and is the editor of the Yale Review. In conversation with her this evening is Clémentine Goldszal, who writes about culture and literature for Elle and Le Monde magazine. She likes to tell stories about how books, movies, and the people who make them shape the world we live in. She lived in Los Angeles for 3 years in the early 2010s and is now based in her hometown of Paris. Her first book of nonfiction, Premier Cri, will be out in France on January 24th and will be available in 2026 in the UK. Please join me in giving them a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Hi, Meghan.
Hi.
I think my first question, so while reading the book, the question that I really wanted to ask you is, how are you?
I'm good. I'm in Paris. I'm at the American Library. I want to thank Rachel for inviting me, and Emma was my former student here many years ago, and I'm talking to you and all of you. No, I'm as well as I'm ever gonna be, which, as the book details, is now a person living with a sense of their own. The precarity of their own body, the ways in which their body is them and isn't them, and is something you have to always contend with as a obdurate material.
This makes me think, I'm always curious about physicality in writing, and I think we don't talk about it as much as we should, actually, the physical act of writing and what it does to the body to be a writer. It does things. It hurts your back, it hurts your neck, it hurts like...
cervical spine.
Yes. Can you talk a little bit to this, like the very practicality of writing this book?
Yeah.
And how you did it?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing I always try to make clear, and this question comes up a lot, especially when I'm speaking to organizations of people who live with chronic illness, is they'll say, how did you do it when you were this sick? I detail in the book a period of being incredibly, incredibly sick from about 2012 to 2014. And I always have to make quite clear that I did not write any of this in that period. In that period, I really could not write in a kind of cogent, coherent way. But I was just talking with Melissa Phoebos, a writer who's here in residence, on a fellowship about the ways in which, if you're a writer, writing is the thing that kind of organizes your sense of self. And as one can imagine, it's a special kind of hell if right when you're dealing with a crisis of identity that is sickness, you can't do the very thing that makes you feel most yourself. And so in that period, where I was living with quite a lot of brain fog, and which we can talk about, and memory problems and language retention problems, what I would do is I would write one line a day. And that was about all I could do. And I wrote a book of poems, Sun and Days, partly doing that. And that's why a lot of that book is in these lyric essays that are kind of a sentence at a time. That form was necessitated by being in a body that could not sustain kind of the effort of thinking that synthesizes. Yeah, and a woman I interviewed for my book, and I mentioned her in one of the chapters, she was a visual artist who was in a car accident that triggered a really complex pain condition, and she had gone. She was a painter, but when she was very, very sick, without knowing, she had a similar experience to mine, where doctors told her, "There's nothing wrong with you. You're fine." She started making tiny miniature drawings. And then when she recovered, her next project was painting abandoned houses. because she had the full range of her body. So, by the time I got to this book, I was like deeply in a state of constant managing of my body. And so I had a very obsessive practice, which was to be at my desk by 10 a.m. so that I could listen to National Public Radio, and in particular, Brian Lehrer. I don't know if any of you are from New York, but I would like listen to the Brian Lehrer jingle, and that would start my brain and body thinking, okay, I can sit in the chair for 3 hours. Yeah.
In the book, it feels like you report as you're going through everything that you're doing, and you're interviewing the doctors that you consult with. How did this come about? How did this unfold? And when did you actually decide that it was going to turn into a book?
Yeah, so some of that is reconstructed, but some of it I'm probably like an obsessive journal note keeper. Are you? Do you scribble?
I don't journal.
I don't journal, but I'm
But I'm
constantly
a journalist,
scribbling.
so
Right,
I tend to interview people.
But this is very similar.
In private, in my life.
I have no single journal, but I'm constantly surrounded by scraps of paper on which I've written things, or now actually my iPhone on which I've noted things. But I had no intention of writing about it. I was trying to figure out what was going on. And so I was keeping notes to sort of think. And then I remember I decided something was wrong. What happened was I was kind of feeling unwell on and off. It was a kind of roller coaster of symptoms, really from when I was 21. And then my mother died when I was 32 in 2008. And later that year, I started to feel really unwell, and it kind of just went downhill. But I went to about 30 doctors, and every single one said, you look incredibly healthy. You have low cholesterol. For some reason, they were quite fixated on my cholesterol, which is extremely low, which, as it turns out, can be a sign of chronic illness, but very few people know that. And so I had absorbed... it's a strange facet of the mind that if it's told things, it does start to believe them. So I thought, okay, I'm well. But one day I was driving home. I was feeling better that day, and I was driving a colleague home from Princeton where I taught, and I looked over at him, and I suddenly thought, I have no idea who this person is. I know that I know them, but I have zero idea who they are. And I got home and asked my husband, is this normal? Because this was a refrain between us. I would say, is this normal? Like, I don't feel good. I feel like I have a headache all the time. Is that normal? And he was like, that's not normal. So really in that moment, I started thinking, this is something I have to kind of record. And I realized that I wanted to write an essay about it for The New Yorker. I realized I had to go to a doctor who might help me. And I began a kind of quest. And that first doctor I saw after this incident did diagnose me with an autoimmune condition. And that was the moment when I kind of formalized that I would start writing about it. But the book kind of began in skips and starts, because at that point it was an essay. And then it took like 6 more months to think, I'm not done. There's more I want to say.
So it was this very moment that you were sort of losing grip on reality.
Exactly. that I had to like create reality.
Yeah. No, it's. I think it's interesting because it's what you describe in the book of making self of yourself by writing.
That's right.
And you say that you started treating yourself as a lab subject.
Yes, that's right.
And I think that when journalists interview people, they feel like lab subjects, and we treat them as lab subjects.
That's right.
And do you think that the process of writing autofiction, or writing about yourself, is treating yourself as a lab subject inherently?
That's a great question. I don't think necessarily. I think I had written about myself in a previous memoir called The Long Goodbye, which was about my mother's death and the experience of grief. And I had written poems that were autobiographical and ones that weren't. And I think I felt less like a lab subject in those and more like a kind of conduit that autobiography is interesting because you can ground a question in specificity of someone's experience. And it just happened to be that I was that person whose experience I was writing about. But it felt more like philosophical or existential. The experience I was writing about here, there were 2 aspects of it. One was the story I thought I was telling at the beginning of the book, which was I thought, what's wrong with me? And how can I get better? Those were the 2 questions I was trying to answer as a lab subject. And I began the book thinking that lab subject was the real story of the book. It turned out that, like any quest, the object I thought was at the end of it was the wrong object. It was a different object. And that was to return to this kind of philosophical, existential question of what is it to be a person in an imperiled body? And what is it to live with uncertainty? And what is it to live in a culture in America that is very invested in this idea of just do it. Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And to actually find that, no, that's not true. And I'm living that story that isn't a story. So both I was a kind of lab subject, and in making myself a lab subject, I was sort of asking the wrong questions in a way.
There's a lot of science in the book, and there's a lot of research, a lot of numbers, a lot of studies that you quote. No, but I say this, it's
much.
A good thing. No, because it's very grounded in reality and in research. It's not whoopee. And but the book
the
is
technical term.
But the book is called Reimagining Chronic Illness, and I wonder what part did imagination play in your experience and in the writing of the book?
Yeah. Well, I think it was that hinge, right, from thinking that so I started being really, really sick in about 2009, medium sick, and then got much sicker. And again, saw so many doctors who would say things like, you're just tired, you know, your iron is low, whatever the explanation was. And when I finally saw this really wonderful doctor, director of women's health in New York, and she diagnosed me with an autoimmune disease, I immediately thought, okay, they're going to give me a pill. They're going to give me a program. I'm going to go from here and I'm going to get to there. I have a very strong will. And the first piece I wrote about autoimmune disease started with me trying to explain what autoimmune disease is. And my editor at the New Yorker read it, and he said, this is a lot of science. And he's like, what we're missing is the scene on the beach where you think about how you feel. And I was like, well, I don't want to do that. or I didn't say that, but in some ways I was pushing against that very... and so wait, your question was, I was getting to it.
It was about imagination.
Imagination. So I think he was the person who was really like, you have to go into what this experience is kind of doing to how you think about the story of yourself. And he was totally right. Like that was the kind of psychoanalytic thing I was resisting through science. And so I think once he opened that up for me, I realized very quickly that this was a book about searching for a reality and shared language that was going to help me name what was going on and help me treat it, hopefully, but also that if I didn't treat it, if what I had was chronic in an age where we want to tell recovery stories, that part of what I had to tell was the story of its effects on me and my imagination and my personhood. Because one of the very particular feelings I had when I went to a doctor's office was that to them, my illness was normal. And to me, it was extraordinary, right? To me, it was different. To me, it was something I had to accommodate myself to and to learn. So I think that the imagination is the kind of pilot flame in me that kept me searching for answers in the face of a lot of science telling me that nothing was wrong or nothing could be done, both of which turned out not to be true. And the imagination was the kind of force that in the moments when I felt I had completely lost who I was, some memory, some flicker of imagination kept me going. That sounds really corny, but I think it's very true. Yeah.
No, it doesn't sound corny.
Yeah.
I think you talk a lot in the book, and it's a fascinating subject about the narrative of illness and how we need a narrative around illness, and even like medical records are a form of narration, right?
That's
they
right.
tell a story from beginning to end, from your checking into the hospital to you checking out. I wonder if fiction and poetry, because you're a poetry writer, has fiction and poetry been of any help?
Absolutely. So I think from the moment that I pivoted from thinking this is a story about explaining to everybody that we live in an age when autoimmune disease is on the rise, and explaining to everyone that, we need to think collectively as a society about chemicals and our food system. Like, there was an early moment where the draft I sent to my editor was like very science laden, like, you need to know all this, like, watch out. And really from that moment when he kind of cracked open, you need to think about how this changes you, what stories you've been telling yourself. I began to realize that there was a way in which reportage and journalism could not capture the story, right? And in fact, I signed a contract to write this book and then immediately stopped writing it and wrote a book of poems. Because I remember very vividly, I was on a fellowship at Radcliffe and I was sitting there and I was like, I can't contain this experience. The whole point is that we don't have adequate language, adequate narratives. There never will be, right? That chronicity resists narrative. It resists brain fog, pain. These resist our attempts to describe them. So I thought, really only poetry is going to allow me to afford the messiness, the non-transactional, the non-transparent aspect of that experience, to be able to represent that fully. And I had to write a book of poems that really leaned into that. I think the last poem, like, the poem actually disappears on the page. Other poems have silence and strike through. So I was really able to play with the materiality of language to show the impossibility of language's, attempts to capture this experience. So by the time I got to this, it felt more like I could try to tell the story, but that I was going to have to talk about the impossibility of telling the story as I went. And it was really only writing poems about it that let me have faith that it was okay to try to narrativize the experience, that wouldn't lose something really important. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. With this book, we're talking about it right now, and you've become someone who talks about chronic illness a lot. And
yes, that's true.
It's been which is for the best, because it means the book has been recognized. But you in the book, you keep saying you keep writing that you don't want your illness to define you.
Correct.
And yet it is now part of your biography as a writer. And I wonder if it's a way for you to make sense of it, or did you just surrender to the fact that your body was now tightly intricated with even your professional life as a writer?
That's a great question. I think yes, and or yes and no. I mean, there's something irreconcilable. Both of those answers are true. Which is to say, I certainly never, as a writer, journalist, thought that I would write a book that felt like it comes right up against activism, right? That was not really my ethos or my aesthetic. It's not something I set out to do. Not that it's bad. I'm not particularly skilled at it, and it wasn't part of what I did in the world. And I think of this book both as trying to be a kind of work of literary nonfiction that is formally crafted, that gives you the hopefully satisfying experience of a well-crafted sort of detective story, but also hopefully facilitating conversations between people, helping change the discourse, certainly in the United States, about illness, and making us more comfortable talking about chronic illness. So there is a kind of surrender, right, in that. The other part of the answer, which I'll share with you, is that I thought about writing a book about pain, sort of just about pain, and pain as a kind of political concept in America, because the history of pain and pain treatment tracks very, very closely with the history of political arguments between the Republicans and the Democrats. Pain from the beginning, the reason it's contested in American medicine has to do with the return of veterans in World War II and our policies about who gets medical care paid for, which is a big question in America. So pain has always been at the heart of that. But then there was this part of me that was like, no, I won't be defined as the writer who writes about pain and illness. And now I'm writing a totally different book, and in some ways. So I think both are true, right? That it's important sometimes to resist a single definition of who you are, and at the same time to submit to it, right? That sort of intersectionality comes out of this idea that, like, we are that thing, but we're also other things. Yeah.
In the book, and while being ill and seeking treatment, you enter this invisible kingdom that gives its title to the book, which is populated by people who are feeling ill. And it's a big community that you discover and that you also gain. I mean, it feels like it gives you some comfort at some point. I wonder how much you wrote the book for them.
I think a large part of it was for them. I mean, I always knew that I wanted it to speak to people who might have no connection to chronic illness, that I, again, wanted it to be like a story that would draw you in, a story of human experience that would be interesting, maybe funny at times. But the title really comes from this moment that did happen where I came out of a doctor's office. This was before I had gotten any kind of diagnosis, and I really wanted to have children, and I was trying to have children, although I could barely walk around the block, which in retrospect seems, like a kind of symptomatic of many things. And I had seen this doctor, and she was like, well, you should really try to have children now. And also, there's nothing wrong with you. And she is someone that a lot of friends had recommended. I had put a lot of faith in this appointment. And I remember I came out into the city, and there was this incredibly dusty Prius in front of her office. And I just remember putting my, leaning against it and just having this moment of kind of a breakdown of just feeling so completely alone in this experience. And a lot of the book is really, in the degree that narrative is in it and imagination is in it, it's because I think the loneliest and most invisible aspect of human experience is that which we do not have language for, or that we have poor language for, right? That we have reductive language for. And what I was finding was that in the biomedical system, if you have a disease that's at the edge of medical knowledge, that doesn't show up on surface level medical tests, you don't exist in language. And that feeling was, there was the sickness, and then there was the hardship of feeling like no one believed I was sick, and so my sickness didn't matter. It had no meaning. No one would ever try to learn from it. No one would ever try to do anything about it for others. And it was the most probably alone I've ever felt. And it was in that moment, I remember vividly, I had this kind of flash that if I, kind of hyper-educated urban person who was a journalist, who was adept at finding answers and learning and researching, felt this way, then there were millions of people in America who also must feel this way, many of whom had fewer resources. And I think the book did really come out of it. And I remember I felt this kind of flash of anger, which was something I was not, I had been feeling a lot of sorrow and victimhood. And there was a kind of heat in that flash of our anger, and a kind of empowerment in that flash of anger, to use a slightly reductive word. So yeah, I think a lot of the book was for the people I thought were being dismissed. Yeah. How
did the promotion of the book go in that regard? Did you talk to a lot of people with chronic illness?
Yeah,
and how did it go? Is it a family that exists underground that the Kingdom of the Well is not aware of?
It does. It exists largely online. Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one thing I didn't really expect. So I did a lot of promotion, both to audiences that had mixes of people who were just interested and had no connection, and people who were intimately connected, family members, caretakers, a lot of caretakers, a lot of children of people, adult children of people who had been chronically ill, who I think that category feels very lonely and very underrepresented. And then I, went and spoke to patient advocacy groups and things like that. One of the things that I hadn't really expected, and I'm curious to hear about your experiences too, Clémentine, is that because I'd written a lot about it, and I had written about myself, I'd published a few pieces in the New Yorker about my illness, I had published pieces in the Atlantic, I felt very inured to, I'm not revealing anything, this is just, I'm going to feel very comfortable, I've already told everyone about this, there's no moment of disclosure that will make me feel vulnerable. And oh my God, was I wrong? Because as soon as the book came out, I did a Fresh Air episode with Terry Gross, and she started asking me questions. And even though the book is a lot about critiquing a culture in which we silence certain aspects of illness, we hide them, we we privatize them when we actually should see them as a social problem. As soon as she started talking about my biography, in my medical biography, and asking me questions about it, I felt this like profound flush of shame. And I just remember I started sweat, and I was like, I cannot talk about this to a public. Like, this is not a material for a public. And then I remembered, okay, no, that's what your whole book is about. You have to do it. But it was really profound to see how much in that moment, when I was writing it on the page was one thing, but being asked to verbalize in front of people, to say, I have been sick, I have been vulnerable, was like, it was incredibly challenging. And then at some point it became a little bit easier. And the reason it became a little bit easier was meeting other people who wanted to be able to say that and had no platform from which to say it.
Are you, so now you're feeling better talking about it? I mean, you've promoted the book for a long time. You're used to it.
Yeah, I think one gets used to things. You know, it's funny, the nature of the kinds of immune-mediated diseases that I'm writing about, of overlapping conditions, is that you have ups and downs. And it certainly, there have been times when an event coincides with a down, and it can feel especially vulnerable again. I spoke at an event where the woman before me spoke about her child dying, you know, and then then I think you go up and it all becomes real again. And it's like moments like that where you're like, oh, right, this is how desperate you feel, that you might give up, that you might be so sick you won't make it. Yeah, that the special pain of these kind of stigmatized illnesses that I'm writing about, where there's a lot of invalidation by the medical system, not intentionally, but just through the way it's structured, which is, there's that special pain of like seeing a lot of young people's lives get quite stuck in place. So I think there are times when that reality becomes, to be honest, actually, I think every time I talk about it, that reality comes back to me.
You teach also. Yeah. And I see the relationship between teacher and student sort of like a psychoanalysis to its analysant, you know, to its patient, that you don't want to reveal too much about yourself as a teacher, or it might diminish your authority or whatever. Has it changed your relationship with your students? Do you teach? Did you talk about your own book openly with your students? Are they aware?
Certainly when the book came out and I was doing television and other things, my students were very aware. And also not aware, because they were 22 and 20 and very much more aware of like their crush and where he had lunch that day. You know, I mean, I'm not that important in their lives. I mean, let's face it. But I think it did change I think being sick changed my relationship with everybody in the world. I think before I got sick, it was sometimes hard for me to understand other people's vulnerability. I was like that slightly untouched. And before my mother died, right, it was that slightly untouched person to whom certain things came a little too easily. But I think it was actually the being sick more than the writing about it and publishing the book that changed my relationship. And I think in particular, though, the publication, what it has meant is that, especially in the era of COVID and long COVID, which is impacting a significant number of people, young people in particular, I'm the person to whom students come at Yale, and they come and they tell me about the problems they're having with other professors, and there is a kind of emotional engagement, emotional labor, to use that phrase, that I think once you're in the kingdom, the invisible kingdom, you recognize other people, and there is this kind of hidden discourse, and they are hiding, they are masking, you know, and passing, as it were, for well.
How do you move on from this? Is there a moment that you intend to close the door on this and be like, chronic illness is, I mean, it's still part of my life, but you won't let it be such a big part of your professional life?
So move on from the book, you mean, or that? Yeah, I don't think I ever will, probably, right? I mean, at this point, I mean, I did say to myself, I'll do a year of like, so there was a year where I was traveling and talking several times a week about the book. And then my son said to me, Mom, you love your book more than you love us. He was 3 or 4. And I thought, okay, that's the moment at which you scale back. So I'm writing another book, and the nature of writing, for me, we were just talking about this, is like, for me, writing is something I do with my need to be obsessed with something. And so there's like a new obsession. It's like being a serial monogamist, right? Like you're like now obsessed with the new subject. And often that means, like, to a fault, I'm sort of uninterested in the previous work, to a fault, because it's better as a writer if you can kind of keep talking about your work and promoting it and trying to get it out there. But that's not the case with this. And I think, because I do live with chronic illness, like it is still a daily reality. And it does feel like the one book I'll likely write that will have this adjacency to activism. And I'm really interested in policy in America and how we change policy to make the lived experience of people with chronic illness better. So I think that piece will never go away. It's just that it might not be as connected to my writing. It might be more this piece that's, here's the book version of it, and then here's the kind of lived activism. And I mean, every day I'm connecting people with doctors. I get emails from people every day.
And you respond to them from strangers?
I sometimes do. I mostly can't, but every now and then I kind of know who they need to talk to, and I can help. But I'm still writing. I'm writing a piece about long COVID that is really about how we acquire knowledge when we don't have knowledge, and how the scientific system acquires knowledge in areas that are contested. How do we think about what we don't know? How do we kind of codify? Like, those questions remain very, very interesting to me. So I see it a little less as like moving on from or not moving on from, and a little more about like, what am I intellectually like interested in? I'm as a writer, I loved your bio because it's about what you love. And I was thinking, okay, what do I love? Like, what I love is to write about areas that affect all of our lives that we think we have a handle on, but that I think we're telling ourselves far too convenient a story that kind of lets us off the hook or lets us look away from things that are painful. And I think we actually have a hunger to look at those things together. Yeah.
Writing the book and having it be released, did you have a fantasy that it would spark a change in the healthcare system in America?
Totally. Even as I was like, the only thing that will change this is like to burn it down and start it again. But yeah, totally. Or at least spark a cultural conversation that would move us from invisibility to visibility. And I think to some degree it has. And to the degree that it has, it's really just been a part of a larger conversation that I think COVID, the pandemic, and the really widespread reality of long COVID has forced many on the medical front lines, because many of the people with long COVID are first responders. They were the first wave of long COVID. They have some of the most severe long COVID. And so I think there was this kind of watershed moment in America. I don't know that that's true here. I think it's very different here.
Yeah, it's very different here.
But it is the case that there is a change in... one of the things I had was Lyme disease that had gone no one had ever tested me for it. No, I had never been diagnosed for it. Lyme disease is quite contested in the United States. And so to be a person who did not have like ideally treated Lyme disease is to be this like contested category. One doctor I interviewed was like, you're like Jenny McCarthy, who's an anti-vaxxer, because I was like, well, don't you think it's possible that I could have been bitten by a tick and never been diagnosed and still be sick? And like, that was just an irritating question to him. It was like a question he just like wanted to have go away. He is one of the leading researchers of Lyme disease. Let me just be very clear. And so where was I going with this?
The politics of it.
So I did want, the more modest version was, I really wanted to make it credible to ask questions about the science of Lyme disease, which in all my years of reporting, I've never encountered a story that I less understand like why the medical system thinks it's so sure about Lyme disease, because it's really not. And I will say, between when I wrote about that for The Atlantic and now, that has totally changed. And I've been invited by the NIH to go speak in Washington about Lyme disease and chronic Lyme and late-stage Lyme disease. And there is now this organization of what's called infection-associated chronic illness research through the NIH that just, they were not talking about this before. That term infection, like, one of the problems of my book was that at one point I was like, how do I explain to readers why I'm talking about Lyme disease and autoimmune disease and a genetic connective tissue? And I had to really come up with, through the help of these researchers, the term infection-associated chronic illness, which now, if you Google it, is kind of everywhere. So, but that wasn't because of me, that was because of these researchers. And then I happened to be the journalist telling that story at that moment that they were trying to tell that story and change the research. And some of that's because the technology we have now is so wildly cool that they are going into people's bodies and taking tissue samples, and they can both find the pathogens using AI and other tools and, you know, in complex computer. They can find what pathogens are there, and more importantly, they can now see how your immune system is reacting to those pathogens. And what they're finding is that there's pathogens we've never even known existed, and they're making our immune systems go wild. Yeah. So, yeah.
You still suffer from this chronic illness, and you were when you were writing the book. And I wonder to what extent the excuse of researching this book and writing this book gave you access to doctors and researchers and scholars that could actually explain to you what was happening besides the traditional medical system.
Well, when I started writing the book, I thought it was only about autoimmune disease. And I had this doctor who believed me. And as soon as I saw her, she said, "I highly suspect you're living with an autoimmune disease. There's a lot of autoimmune disease in my family. And yet when you go to, in my extended family on both sides, yet when you go to a doctor's office, you do the medical history, they ask you about cancer and heart disease. And they do not ask you about autoimmune disease, although it's quite genetic, shows up in relatively young people, especially women, and it's hard to test for. So to my mind, that's like something we should start to do. But it definitely crossed my mind that because I was writing about it, I could get access to people. But in fact, the people who really wanted to talk to me after the New Yorker piece was published were mostly people who were like, I've invented a device. It's called the Mordecai. It detects evil spirits inside you. And I will give you a free treatment and then a follow-up treatment for $1,000. There was like a lot of that. Or the real problem is that you have a second heart behind your knee, someone wrote me.
I love the second heart.
And we need to get that second heart working. And if you come up to Syracuse, New York, I will do it for you. Very generous, but I did not avail myself of them. But the other thing that did happen was that a bunch of people wrote to me and said, all the symptoms you're describing as puzzling to your doctors and not quite clearly related to your autoimmune disease are symptoms of Lyme disease. And my husband had written a book called The Wisdom of the Crowd about how getting non-experts together to guess where a lost submarine is helped the CIA find that wasn't the CIA, the Department of Defense find the submarine that no expert found. And I went to him and I was like, if we believe in the wisdom of the crowd, I need to go see a Lyme doctor. And it was the case that I did talk to a friend at the New Yorker who'd written about Lyme disease and say, would you put me in touch? And that helped me. And certainly what I would say now is that it was less writing the book and it's a little bit more now. It's actually been more writing about long COVID. I do have a bunch of people on speed dial that now when I have a new problem, I just, yeah. So it was a little less the process of the book and a little bit more the outcome of the book has made it much easier. But I'm constitutionally, in fact, they kind of are annoyed at me because I got COVID and I got very sick afterward. And my friend was like, why would you not call? And I was like, I don't know. I don't want to trade on my, yeah. But yeah.
You talk about all these cookie beliefs. And I think that faith is something that goes through the book. It's about your own faith and believing that you're sick, the faith of other people and what you're actually telling them. And then there's this idea of if you truly believe, you will get better. Or I don't know, to me, I'm French, but faith seems to be such a big part of the American way of life and consciousness. And it's just a big thing in America, I think much bigger than it is in France. not religious for faith exclusively, but I wonder if this this process changed your relationship to faith. Did you lose it? Did you gain some?
So interesting, because faith is a word I don't ever use, I think, in the book. And no one's ever asked me about faith, but I've never been interviewed by a French interviewer before. So I think you have an insight that
it's
no
the French
American.
Touch.
Yes, you've seen something that I resist immediately. But I think you're right. I want to say, no, it wasn't faith. It was my initial response was to think, it's not faith, it's recognition is what I'm interested in, right? Like, I'm a poet. I believe in the power of language to name things that seem like they can't be named. But listening to you, I'm like, oh my God, I'm such an American. Like, I was like, I will get diagnosed. I will get better. That is what my book is about. And then I'm like, no, that's not what life is actually about. The real discovery here is that faith does not carry us through, but that's a kind of faith in of itself, isn't it? Like, you've made me see the book totally differently. I think you're right. I think there's this very American, even as I'm critiquing the just do it, I'm just doing it. Yeah, no, totally. That's the sort of iterative problem, right? And that was the problem of like how to end the book, because I was aware of that.
Yes.
Because I did get largely better. I was treated for Lyme disease, and I went from being bedridden to having children and being able to come to Paris and talk to all of you and living a 80% of the time kind of normal life. Like, yeah. But I think, I do think that I do try to kind of identify and critique that in the end and kind of come back to this question of uncertainty. And the last image of the book is this idea that the sickness opened this kind of window in my body that I'm now really aware, like anything can come through that window at any time. That window is metaphorical, right?
Yeah.
The window is my understanding of embodiment. But you're right.
I think just my last question at the heart of this book, and to me it's like, there's a few conditions in life that you can only write from the verge of, which is, I don't know, deep melancholy, depression, being born, dying, dying, being extremely poor, I think, and being extremely ill.
Yeah.
You can't write, like you can experience it, but then you have to somehow get out of it to write about it. Is it something that's frustrating to you that you were not able to write when you were in the midst of it?
I had these iPhone notes. And actually, yes. So I was writing, but not making, I'd say in the book at one point, when I was really sick, I could have written this sentence, but I couldn't have written this paragraph. Two things. One, the hardest part of writing this book was trying to describe pain, trying to describe brain fog, and trying to describe the strange existential sense I had that was really like a symptom, which was that I was not myself anymore. Like that something fundamental in my brain was not true anymore. And I think that was the infection. I mean, I know now that there were aspects of my behavior that are gone now. But there was a moment where I was very, very stuck in the book, to your question. And it's in the chapter that's called Nadir, I think. And I had written all this. I had writing the book up to the point where I get diagnosed with Lyme disease. And I thought, I'm just totally stuck. And I don't know, I can't describe what it feels like to be in pain, what it felt like to be in this. It was like being in a plane. It was like living and waiting for Godot. Like, that was what it was like. And I just couldn't find language for it. And I went back to my iPhone and I found this story I had started to write, which and then I thought, okay, I can write this, because the story is very strange. The line is very strange. And that's in that chapter is finding. And so then I narrate that. And the other breakthrough I really had to have was that because the book is really critical and is a critique of the reflexive impulse in the 21st century, certainly in America, to see poorly understood medical conditions as essentially psychological in nature. That in the book, I'm very insistent, I'm not experiencing depression, I'm not experiencing anxiety. But when I became the sickest, there was this period where I was depressed, which is very, very common in people who are chronically ill or don't yet have a diagnosis, that you can also become depressed. There's also a lot of comorbidity between autoimmune disease and depression because of inflammation and other things. And I had resisted so much, and I thought, oh no, I have to explain that I'm kind of in this foggy plane, and that's physical and now mental. And I have to acknowledge that. I have to write the thing I don't want to say that's not causing this, but it has become a feature of it. And so I think that, that finding that note, though, helped me see it. And it is, you're right, that there's something so transient about our experience. And if we don't keep these little notes or these little records, when you go back to it with the coolness of surviving. And you need some of these little fragments from the heat of the verge, I think, or
I think they irrigate the book, and that's what make it amazing to read.
Thank you.
I think we have 15 minutes for questions from the audience, in person and online. So there's a microphone that's going to be passed. Anybody have a question?
This was a truly remarkable conversation. A gift in many ways.
Thank you. Thank you.
The title of this book suggests some association with Susan Sontag.
Yeah.
With the two kingdoms, and I wonder if you could talk about how you undertook this project in relation to illness as metaphor, how you see what you're doing as something else.
Yeah. So that's a great question, which is about the title kind of is in dialogue with Susan Sontag, a quote, which is actually the epigraph of the book, which is, at some point, I'm going to butcher it. Well, actually, I can just read it. Hang on. Let me not butcher Susan Sontag. But
she won't mind.
The quote, which is from her book Illness as Metaphor, is, "Illness is the night side of life, a more onerous citizenship. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick. Although we all prefer to use only the good passport, sooner or later each of us is obliged, at least for a spell, to identify ourselves as citizens of that other place." And so when I was, the book is very much in dialogue with Illness as Metaphor. That book was the kind of presiding spirit of my book. And Illness as Metaphor is often kind of talked about in an overly reductive way to be a critique of using metaphor to describe illness. She was not, though, saying we shouldn't describe pain metaphorically, like it's a stinging pain or a stabbing pain. She was saying we shouldn't allow particular physiological, biomedical, organic diseases to be seen as a symptom of culture, a symptom of psychology, human psychology, in a way that makes us stop thinking about them also as organic diseases, as physical diseases. And she's talking about cancer and breast cancer in particular, and the way that cancer was once seen as a disease of stressed people, and before that tuberculosis seen as a disease of romantic souls. I don't know if any of you read Anne of Green Gables, but there's like Ruby, the tubercular, like she's this like high-strung butterfly, like romantic, and like she gets tuberculosis and dies. And so I was really sort of trying to update that for the 21st century, and the book begins by saying if every age has a kind of signature representative disease that represents some story it's telling itself, but also something like in psychoanalysis that it's hiding from itself, autoimmune and immune-mediated diseases are ours. And what I was doing that was quite like Sontag. So I think there's a lot that's like Sontag, but she's not at all she's talking about a very different category of experience. So I did see myself as updating her to maybe more explicitly talk about the ways in which we tend to put responsibility for autoimmune disease and management of autoimmune disease on the person. Whereas I think we need to talk about the social that's contributing. There's an epidemic rise of autoimmune disease in Western countries. That means there is a kind of social policy-based something is going on that's triggering that. It's not individuals making bad choices. It's how we are existing in the polity. And I really wanted to see autoimmune disease and to critique the ways that the kinds of stories we're telling ourselves about autoimmune disease, and to look at the real story, which I think is the story of changes in environment, changes in the rise of individualism and the challenges. I think what's really different, Sontag never acknowledges in Illness's metaphor that she had breast cancer. And so that was my kind of critique, or my response to her, was to say, no, I am going to talk about this because I'm going to implicate myself and risk that kind of implication. Because what you risk when you write about yourself is that you become not credible because you're an invested party. The journalist is treating others as a lab subject, right? The journalist is not supposed to be invested in the subject. It's not supposed to be a subject. So there was a kind of instability there that I was working with.
We have a question on Zoom, if I may read it.
Let's not discriminate against the Zoomers.
Oh, can you help me here? I'm with the first one. All right. Great talk. Thank you for making it available online. Do you have a part of the book you are most proud of?
That's such a good question. I think the part that was hardest and that felt the most important, like it felt like a hinge that the book would have been had less depth without it, is the first 3 chapters of part 2, which is called Mysteries, which is autoimmunity as metaphor, mind, body, particularly autoimmunity as metaphor and mind, body, and then positive thinking, which is the moment where I really articulate. I've been treating this as like my personal project to fix. We treat it as everyone's personal, but actually it's a social problem that we're all alone in our kitchens making gluten-free, dairy-free, nut-free dinners for ourselves, and then our family something else. So it was really hard to articulate that section, and I think it was really important to talk about the fact that so many of the people I interviewed saw their autoimmunity as when your immune system turns on itself. And so many of the women I interviewed said, it's because I've been living an inauthentic life. I triggered this autoimmune disease because I gave too much of myself to my children, or I married the wrong person, or I lived the wrong life. They felt responsible for their illness, and I had too. And so it was very painful to confront that and to try to articulate that and to try to offer a new way of thinking about autoimmunity as metaphor. So I think that's the section.
I think this is very American. This
Yes.
is where we completely part with the French. No, it's
Yeah,
true.
it's true. Yeah,
It's
yeah.
It's
Yes.
Puritanism.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. It's Puritanism.
Like, yeah,
yes.
your body is impure,
and,
it's sick.
And,
yeah.
and it's the elevation of individualism as a creed above all others. If we're individualists and everything good in us is created by us, everything bad in us is also created by us, right? I mean, we aren't hypocrites in that way. We do believe we're responsible for our failures. Yeah.
You had a question?
Yeah, you might have answered some of it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But for somebody who's dealing with chronic illness and very much in it, and you have come a long way and it's still there, but for somebody who doesn't quite have that light at the end of the tunnel, is there advice or something you wish you would have known at that point?
Yeah.
I have a second.
That's a great question. I think the number one thing I wish of my earliest self in this is that I would have believed in my perceptions more and felt like I was worth insisting upon in the face of experts telling me, or that my intuitions, my sense, my lived experience was worth insisting upon. Or, I think the other piece might be like go toward joy. You know, that I was really fixated on what I was losing, and maybe if I, well, that's how I've managed now, right? Just to kind of go toward it. Very hard when you're in it, but like those little tiny things, I think, were what kept me going. Yeah.
Another
Someone
question?
else? I have a question.
Yeah.
In your research, did you run into practitioners of narrative medicine?
Yes. And I'm kind of critical. I don't really get into
Yeah.
it in the book because narrative medicine is overall a good thing, but it's also like kind of a Band-Aid on the problem. I mean, it's the right step, which is to start looking at the narratives we tell ourselves and to really think about those narratives, right? And I interviewed some practitioners of narrative medicine, but a lot of narrative medicine kind of works in where it's like already acceptable to like be like, oh, which is around it's just around the experience of doctors, patients, like, but it has not gone into contested areas. Like, you don't find narrative medicine around vaccine injury that is real, right? Because no one wants to talk about vaccine injury that's real. I'm not talking about anti-vax, but COVID, there's a lot of reporting right now around things like there's a big study that just came out about like a very small percentage of people having long COVID triggered by vaccine. Like, it's just interesting that we don't seem to. So Lyme disease, there was not a lot of like narrative medicine around Lyme disease because people just didn't want to talk about it. So I think it's really important, but it's also kind of within the system. And what we need, I think, is to actually go into medical education and to really start critiquing within medical education, or not critiquing, but complicating the reality that doctors and scientists have expertise, and that expertise is incredibly important, and that science is a process that discovers truths. And at the same time, it's a human process, it's a process, and it's iterative, and we get things wrong. And that doesn't mean science is not real and that we shouldn't listen to science. But what sometimes happens is science and patient advocates get pitted against each other. And that's the area that I'm really interested in. And that's where narrative medicine hasn't quite narrativized that. Like, what do we do when patients believe science is wrong? Right now, science says, well, you're crazy. That's what it's done over and over and over again. It's happening right now with long COVID, discrediting and various things. Although science believes in long COVID, but science and culture are together. So how do we, if part of what we need to do is make expertise willing to look at its mistakes systemically, individually, while not seeming to kind of, I think a lot of times experts are really worried in medicine about granting their own mistakes, or saying, I don't know. One doctor said we were taught to never say, I don't know, because they worry that they're going to undermine science. But I think actually that's how you rebuild trust in science. But it's hard. There's no doubt in the age of misinformation, this is like an impossible, thorny topic. But that's why I just think narrative medicine is like the Band-Aid. Like, the real problem is like expertise, the asymmetric relationship of expertise to patient, but the patient is a kind of expert in their body. How do we negotiate that? Like, kind of ontologically. It's really complicated, yeah.
Here you go.
Hey, Megan.
Hi.
I was thinking about the conversation you all had about faith.
Yeah.
And I was also thinking about bravery and wondering about your experience of deciding to have children in the midst of your illness. And that seems to me a very brave decision, and perhaps a leap of faith sort of decision to have made. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I don't know if it was brave or just inane. Or what's the word? Deluded. I really wanted to have children. I was trying to have children when I was really sick. And I do remember, I don't know if I put it in the book, I do remember saying to my husband, I think if I got pregnant, I might die. And that was this really but I still kept trying. But then at some point I realized that maybe I had Lyme disease, and I stopped trying to get pregnant because I thought I have to treat this first. And I think, I don't know that it was bravery, but I got, the remarkable thing about discovering the tick-borne illness was that I really did get so much better with antibiotic treatment so quickly. It left many problems in its wake that I still live with, but I went from like really struggling to function to functioning pretty well till 6 p.m. most days if I avoid cold, eat the right foods, drink salty water, like whatever, my whole little biohacks that get me through the day. But I was definitely scared in the pregnancy, and I was scared of what pregnancy itself will do, because pregnancy is a state in which the immune system and the fetus are in a kind of complicated relationship to one another. And in fact, I had many early miscarriages, and I had to have a hyper-medicalized, edge of medical knowledge pregnancy. I don't write about it in the book because my editor, I wrote about it and she thought I should cut it, so I cut it. But I did this treatment that's very at the edge of acceptance, where you try to get your immune system to accept that you have someone else in your body. So it was hard. It was like a very scary, very medicalized process. And then I felt better when I was pregnant than I've ever felt, which sometimes happens. And then I got really, really sick after both kids were born. And that was really hard, But I think the difference, I remember saying to my doctor and to Jim, the difference is like, now I know what's causing the sickness. Like now I know what to do. I have people to talk, and so and I think that's part of the premise and project of the book, is to say, this is what we owe. We owe it to people with stigmatized illness to listen to them and to try to understand and to do science, because you can survive a lot as a human when there's science and names and doctors and people to help, And I was very lucky and I was very privileged. And my dad died and left me some money that I used to get a lot of help when I was really, really sick with a 6-week-old. Yeah.
We have time for one last question. Oh, one. You can discuss.
We'll just run a little bit over.
It's okay. I'll be short in my answers.
It's a short question, but you mentioned that you're going to take your activism to medical schools. Where else? Because given what's going on in the United States right now with the change of administration, I probably shouldn't even bring this up. But
I don't know what you're talking about.
I know. But, talking about science.
Yeah. I'm trying to finish a book that I'm like sort of more, I feel urgently I have to finish it so that I can actually write some magazine articles. And one of the things I want to write about is I'm really interested in both writing about the history of how we arrived here, but what do we do about it? The age of misinformation and the decline of trust in experts. And I'm very critical of experts, not of experts, but of the system of expertise that that we're in, and the kind of. So I'm really interested, like, is it possible to try to understand why people are drawn to RFK Jr., right, while not believing in any way and being critical of RFK? Like, can I, that's what I'm interested in, is like trying to tell the story of how people are feeling and the kind of institutional, both institutional and kind of ontological or, epistemic choices we made when we built up public science, when we built up, in particular, insurance-based medicine, like what has led us here and what might get us out, right? Because what most science journalism right now is like, these people are idiots. Or on the other side, you have people being like, well, it's a conspiracy, and actually, we have a system that is of crisis care and it doesn't actually give you health care. And I'm sympathetic to that critique, but I'm also not sympathetic to some of where we're going, right? Or rather, it's not about sympathy. I just think it's wrong. It's anti-expertise. It's anti-knowledge. So I do want to, I guess, keep writing. I mean, one of the ways I can be helpful is to write and report. Yeah.
Last question.
You talk a lot about autoimmune illnesses, and I know that they affect men, but they tend to affect women more. And I wonder if you talk about that in your book, and where is the place of feminism in what you have to say about chronic illness?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, so a lot of the book is about women and about the fact that roughly 75% across the many categories of autoimmune disease, 75% of people who live with autoimmune disease are women. There are a couple of specific autoimmune diseases that are experienced mostly by men, but most of them are experienced mostly by women. So there's an entire chapter about, well, there's two things. There's a lot about this, but one chapter is really about how, to your point about feminism, how is the fact that it's primarily women living with immune-mediated diseases affecting the fact that it's so invisible? And I look back to the 19th century the 19th century kind of rise of the diagnosis of hysteria as a condition that was first thought to be organic. And then, and this happens right at the moment, by the way, that women are starting to organize for suffrage, for the vote, and to get out of the house. And you can really trace the rise of a diagnosis of hysteria up with kind of women's rights push. And then when doctors could not cure hysteria because they had sort of the wrong idea about what it was, they decided it was psychological. And that happens before Freud. Sort of slowly happens. First we get Charcot, and then Freud comes along and he's like, well, the more you say something is real and we can't find evidence, the more that shows a kind of psychic, right, like wound there. Like there's the way in which the very insistence becomes the sign of your unreliability. And I really trace like how the fact that it's women. And so that's the sort of, I think, I've for some years wrote a column about feminism. And then later in the book, when I'm writing about autoimmunity as metaphor, I'm really interested too in the fact that it's mostly women who are telling themselves these stories and feeling responsible for it. Then also, part of the critique of the medical system is that the journalist Maya Dusenberry, who's written about kind of knowledge gap in women's health and men's health, coined this idea that like we have both a kind of knowledge gap and an interest gap. Like we don't know that much about women's health because we just haven't studied it, and we don't trust women to be good reporters of their experience. So I really chart the ways in which we have not studied autoimmune disease because it's primarily, and I look at that history.